So good evening, everyone. Let's bow in. Welcome to the Buddhist Path of Awakening course. Tonight we're beginning the new text by Khenpo Tsultrim Gyatso, entitled Progressive Stages of Meditation on Emptiness. Michael, are you going to lead off? Okay.
Yes. So I am going to begin by talking about some of the material that's in the preface and the introduction to this text. But first of all, welcome everyone. This is a text which, like several others, I've read several times, and every time I get something new out of it, including this time. The preface begins with some biographical information about Khenpo Tsultrim Gyatso Rinpoche, which I'm not going to repeat. I'll just go into a little bit of detail, though, what a Khenpo is. The Khenpo basically is it's the equivalent of an advanced degree. It requires anywhere from 9 to 16 years of intense study, depending on the particular tradition and shedra and monastery that a teacher belongs to. In addition to that, Khenpo Tsultrim Gyatso engaged in quite a bit of solitary retreat practice in caves and retreat huts and things of that nature in Bhutan. So he actually met with Trungpa Rinpoche sometime in the mid to late 1980s, and it's said that after they met, one of the people who was present said about Khenpo Tsultrim, he's a yogi and a scholar, to which Trungpa Rinpoche said, more yogi than scholar, which was in his mind a very, very good thing. And then he did teach in the Buddhist community in Boulder in the 1980s for on at least one occasion. I actually was able to attend an interview with him because he taught in Hartford, Connecticut, somewhere in the mid to late 90s. I can't remember the exact date. And it was actually a very small group. I was able to ask him a question, and I'll share that with you because I think it was helpful to me, but also it relates directly to reading this text and some of the things that we're going to be talking about over the next few weeks. And the question I asked him, I cannot remember the exact circumstances that provoked the question, but the basic thrust of the question was that I was feeling some frustration and pain over the back and forth in meditation practice, from sometimes being present and then other times being completely lost and confused and engaging in behaviors that afterward I regretted. Nothing severe, but bothersome to me. His answer was very helpful. What he said essentially is that that's how it is for everyone, and that the one word in Tibetan for meditation is gom, which means to become familiar or to become habituated to. And so through repeated practice, through persistence in practice, we become increasingly habituated to being present, habitually familiar with being awake, and that's how our practice develops. And in much the same way, this applies to each one of the chapters in this book. There's not one of the contemplations that's one and done for most of us. It takes repeated practice, repeated contemplation, repeated meditation to fully get, in a real stable way, in a real realized way, what he's talking about in each one of these chapters. So it takes persistent practice and repetition, you could say, to erode the very deeply ingrained habits of fixated mind, that we have to wear away habituated mind over time, that there's no one and done for most of us anyway. And as an example of this, one of the things that we'll be talking about in the first chapter is the notion of taking things as permanent or lasting. And I think we know conceptually that things change over time. We know our bodies change over time. We know that the things around us change over time. But if we actually look at how we behave, what we think, what we feel in the moment, we realize that quite often we hold on to things, get fixated on things as if they were permanent. Even though if someone asked us or we even thought about it a little bit, we'd say, oh, yeah, I know it's not going to be the same tomorrow or next year or whenever, from what it is now. So it takes repeated practice, repeated effort, repeated contemplation to really work these things into our system, or rather to let go of the fixations that prevent us from seeing things as they actually are. So with that, I think we can begin with the introduction, and the introduction describes the text as a series of meditation practices on a particular aspect of the Buddhist teachings. That particular aspect of the Buddhist teachings on emptiness or absolute truth. And as it says in the introduction, we begin with a coarse or common sense understanding and progress through increasingly subtle and more refined stages until one arrives at a complete and perfect understanding. So these are the progressive stages of meditation that we'll be going through over the next few weeks. Sometimes this same idea is expressed in the sense that the Buddhists presented both provisional teachings and definitive teachings. And I think we've talked about this before. The idea of a provisional teaching is this is what the Buddha taught that was understandable to us with ordinary conventional thinking, ordinary perceptions of things. And those are the provisional teachings. And the definitive teachings are the ultimate meaning, ultimate understanding that develops through meditation, practice, and study. It's not that the provisional is untrue or false, but they're partially true, and they're a step along the way. And that's the whole idea of these progressive stages of meditation on emptiness. But it's not that one stage is false in any way. It's just not the complete truth. So each stage, as it says in the introduction, prepares the mind for the next insofar as each step, insofar as each step is fully integrated into one's understanding. And the key phrase there is fully integrated into one's understanding. And with that, the next section of the introduction goes into the three stages in the process of understanding. And we've studied this before. Trungpa Rinpoche presented it in the Profound Treasury teachings, even in the Hinayana text, The Path of Individual Liberation. More traditionally, it's called the three prajnas. Trungpa Rinpoche called them hearing, contemplating, and meditating. And it's through these three practices that we develop, or you could say cultivate or sharpen prajna. It's ultimately prajna that sees emptiness, prajna that sees shunyata. So in this text, hearing is described as listening or studying, with the most important thing being that we have an open mind that doesn't distort what's heard or studied. Now, these three are presented: hearing, contemplating, meditating, or in this text, listening, reflecting, and meditating. It's easy to think of them as three steps, 1, 2, 3, but in reality, they're more interactive or recursive than that. So, for instance, through meditation and contemplation, but particularly through meditation, we develop the ability to have an open mind, as opposed to a mind that's so distracted or so caught up in our own thinking. That we don't have an open mind. We're too speedy or we're too caught up in our own ideas to actually hear what's being presented to us. So really think of these three as each feeding the other. Although usually it begins with some hearing and studying, but that actually they work interactively, you could say. So that's the most important thing with listening or hearing, is having an open mind that doesn't distort what's being presented. The second one, contemplating, the second of the three prajnas is contemplation or contemplating, or here is called reflecting. And with this, we reflect on what we've heard in order to clarify its true significance. In some cases, contemplation is presented as we make some determination as what seems true to us. This goes back to the Buddha's teaching that we shouldn't take what he says just on faith or blind faith, but we should actually think about it. Actually, the literal instruction was to approach the teachings like a goldsmith checks gold that he's about to buy, that we beat it, test it, and make sure that it's the real thing. But there's also another level of contemplating or reflecting, which is increasingly important to see what is true of us. What do we recognize in our experience, or how do these teachings illuminate something in our experience that we can come to realize, that we can come to recognize in direct experience? And then the third stage, meditating, is integrating whatever newly acquired knowledge, newly acquired insight into our being or character. As it says in the introduction, we actually put it into practice in the sense of doing or being it, as opposed to just thinking about it, so that it becomes an experiential reality for us. It's not a question, as it says in the introduction, of trying to be perfect in some goal-oriented way, but literally it becomes our actual experience. It becomes who we are through the practice of meditation. The introduction then talks about 3 fields of investigation, which is another way of thinking about hearing, contemplating, and meditating, or listening, reflecting, and meditating. And says the whole of Buddhism is actually structured around this threefold training in listening, reflecting, and meditating. And says scholars study or listen, philosophers study valid means of knowing and reasoning, how give us the tools to actually be able to discern what's true or false, which is reflection. But yogins and meditators are those who have established, this is, I think, important. Yogins and meditators are those who have established through listening and reflecting what must be the case, and engage in training themselves in the art of abandoning their delusions. Because that's really what this text is asking us to do, to listen, reflect, and in working in meditation, having listened and reflected on what must be the case, to engage in training ourselves in the art of abandoning our delusions. As it says in the introduction, it's one thing to decide through reasoning what must be true, and another to actually see the world in that way. And I think this goes all the way back to Trungpa Rinpoche's comment about Khenpo Tsultrim Gyamtso, that he was more yogi than scholar. That it wasn't just his study, but his practice as well that allowed him to develop, actually see the world in a clear and open way. So the idea is that by relying on these 3 practices, listening, reflecting, meditating, with each enhancing the other, that the fog of, as it says in the introduction, the fog of confusion and ignorance is removed, and knowledge and understanding shine forth. The introduction talks about 3 ways to remove doubt, which also relate back to hearing, contemplating, and meditating, listening, reflecting, and meditating. That first we study with qualified teachers, and in this particular case, we could think of Khenpo Tsultrim Gyamtso through this text as helping us understand something about emptiness. That we reflect for ourselves on what's clear to us and what's unclear, and that we think about it and ask questions about any doubts or uncertainty we might have, that we keep doing this until there's real certitude that what's being presented to us rings true, not just conceptually, but most importantly in terms of our actual in the moment experience. And then finally, we see what's true in meditation, what we actually experience directly. And as it says in the introduction, eventually one's meditation stabilizes, free from hesitation or uncertainty. But usually this begins with glimpses, with moments of understanding, moments of clarity, moments of peace, moments of just insight. And that as we continue to practice and study and persist in our practice and study, as Khenpo said, we become habituated, become increasingly familiar with a different way of seeing things, a different way of being in the world. And then the text, the introduction, uses fairly traditional Tibetan metaphors for what it's like to be missing either the hearing, the contemplating, or meditating, where it says that meditation without listening and reflecting is blind, but listening and reflecting without meditation is like having eyesight and no legs. There are somewhat different metaphors that essentially say the same thing, that meditating without hearing and contemplating is like a blind man wandering in the plains, and hearing and contemplating without meditation is like an armless man trying to scale a cliff. So there's something seriously missing if we don't engage with all three prajnas, and it will, definitely be a hindrance to our practice and study. And the introduction goes into three texts to follow, which we're not reading, but we've essentially had the same background mainly through studying the profound treasury. It mentions Gampopa's jewel ornament of liberation as presenting elements of relative truth, things like karma, impermanence, love, and compassion. I would also add the Four Noble Truths. And those of us who, I think most people here have read or are now with the Thursday night class going through the path of individual liberation, the Trungpa Rinpoche's profound treasury text that's based on his Hinayana seminary teachings. And that's exactly what it covers. It presents the relative truth that the Buddha presented in terms of, topics such as the Four Noble Truths, impermanence, and so on. He mentions, secondly, the introduction mentions, secondly, a Madhyamaka text by Chandrakirti, which involves reflection and meditation on the absolute truth of emptiness. And a lot of this is covered in this book as well. So that is something that we'll be going through in some of these chapters. Sometimes the first set of teachings presented in the jewel ornament or in the Hinayana text are referred to as the first turning of the wheel, where the Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths and other things such as impermanence, suffering, and egolessness. The Madhyamaka text is one of many that points to the second turning of the wheel. The teachings on emptiness or shunyata correspond directly most to the sense of that expression, form is emptiness. It also mentions the Uttara Tantra, which is a text that's given by Maitreya to a Sangha, I believe, which is the teachings on Tathagata or Buddha nature teachings, or as it says in the introduction, the clear light of mind. And it says, this is a direct quote from the introduction, these teachings emphasize that for the ultimate realization of Buddhahood to arise, one has to experience one's true nature without any conceptual effort to clear away delusion or to create an enlightened state. And this actually is presented somewhat in the last chapter of this text, the final of the progressive stages that we'll be going through. But this corresponds most directly to the third turning of the wheel, emptiness is form. And if you remember the reading that we did on Shunyata 3 weeks back from Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, where Trungpa Rinpoche talks about ultimately letting go of conceptual mind altogether through seeing form as emptiness, emptiness as form. That's what this is referring to, just a complete letting go of conceptual confusion and just simply being present with things as they are, the world as it is. The introduction talks a little bit about the importance of the relative truth, that without some understanding of relative truth, and meditation on emptiness can be misleading and dangerous. Usually what this refers to, the danger is getting into a kind of nihilistic mindset, thinking that nothing matters, it's all relative, disregarding cause and effect, which leads to a lack of compassion and at times actually actions leading to harm because of some confusion of an understanding shunyata as meaning that nothing matters. There are 3 sentences, I think, in this section on relative truth that are, I think, really important to know. The first is, although insight may come quickly, stability comes slowly. And this, again, just refers to the need to work with this material over and over. We're quite habituated, quite familiar with taking things to be real in a way that they're not. In this lifetime, and I believe in rebirth over many, many lifetimes, this is a deeply ingrained habit to take ourselves as real, things in the world around us as real in ways that they're not. The second is that the statement that the relative truth is the foundation of all the Buddhist teaching because it gives a proper understanding of what's to be abandoned and what's to be cultivated. And the most important thing here is understanding how wholesome actions, engaging in meditation practice, engaging in study, lead to the conditions where the three prajnas can be fruitful. And for this reason, it's said that it's through respecting the relative truth that the absolute truth can be realized. And then the absolute truth is the end point of analysis, the most fundamental, basic element of existence. If you read the introduction, it gives the example of a clay pot, which we take to be real as it is, but then it can be broken down into smaller and smaller pieces, into atoms, finally into atomic particles, which are increasingly ungraspable, uncertain. And in that same way, absolute truth presents itself differently to practitioners at different levels of practice. And then it goes, the final part of the introduction just talks about what the progressive stages of meditation are in terms of the different philosophical schools that each one's come from. The Shravaka to begin with, the Chittamatra, two divisions of the Madhyamaka, and finally the Shentong. Tonight we're going to be talking about the Shravaka. And as it says, though these different schools are named after the Buddhist schools that formulated them, what they really represent are stages in the development of an individual's understanding of emptiness. And as it says in the introduction, in so many words, that it takes patience and persistence, regular practice, regular study to work with this, and that we start with the basics, starting with the Shravaka, and move from there. And gives two different metaphors for this process. One is that it's like refining gold ore so that it becomes increasingly pure and not mixed with impurities. And the other metaphor that it gave for this progressive stages was like finding a needle on the mountain, where first we have very general directions to find the mountain, and then more increasingly specific directions to actually find where the needle is, until finally we have to use our eyes to actually see it. And then it's finally said that the early stages brings one nearer and nearer to the true realization of emptiness. And then finally, it's through our direct perception that it's seen. So that's ultimately what we're working toward step by step. So with that, we can, I'll turn it over to John and we'll begin talking about the Shravaka point of view.
Thank you, Michael. This reminds me of a phrase that might amuse you. I learned it in college in philosophy courses. The phrase is ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Anybody familiar with that phrase? It's the idea that the development of the individual recapitulates the development of the species. So when a fetus is born, is conceived and begins taking form in the womb, it has qualities of for instance, sort of reptilian qualities, which hark back to the beginning of our species. And this approach to Buddhism that Khenpo Tsultrim Gyatso is taking, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, is that the development of the individual, each one of us, recapitulates the development of the path, or vice versa. That the description of the way the path evolves recapitulates our development. So we start with stage one, the Shravaka approach. Shravaka means hearer or listener, and speaker as well, but basically it means listener. And this is not unimportant at all. In fact, it's quite profound. Each one of us could experience this profundity, because what it's about is the emptiness of the self. There's a twofold emptiness in Buddhism, the emptiness of I and the emptiness of other, meaning that the two don't really exist. Now, what does it mean not to exist? There's a key term with which I would hope you would become familiar, and that term is svabhava. Sva means own, bhava means being, svabhava. And this is a word that recapitulates the false assumptions and beliefs that we have about the nature of reality, both of ourselves and of the external world, external to us. Svabhava basically assumes that everything that exists has three fundamental qualities. that things exist like I, or the computer screen you're looking at, or whatever it may be, exist over time. They endure. The second quality is that things are independent, that things have their own personal existence and independent of a lot of other things. And the third quality is that things are unitary, that this I is one thing, this computer screen is one thing. And in fact, Buddhism denies all three. It says that the self here, in which we take for granted, we assume that I exist, animals do too. And we walk around protecting ourselves and self-aggrandizing and basically treating the self as though we're very valuable. So both animals and humans act as if they have a self to protect and preserve. And one regards this behavior as automatic and instinctive, as well as normal. The implication is that any self, the self, would be happy if all pain and suffering and threat of non-existence were removed. And yet we're very unclear as to what this self really is. We think that it is lasting, single, and independent. And yet, from a Buddhist perspective, nothing lasts. Everything is constantly changing. And I thought, just for humor's sake, I'd show you something. I'm going to share the screen for a minute here. Everybody see that? That's me about 75 years ago. How much of me can you see in that today, huh? Things have changed a little bit. Here we go, gotta get back. So the idea is that everything is changing utterly. Nothing endures, not even anything. Atoms, nothing, quarks. Everything is constantly dying and being reborn and being replaced by something somewhat different, like that picture in this reality here today. I found that in a box recently. So, and at the same time, we're very unclear as to what this self really is. All our suffering is associated with the preoccupation that we have this lasting, separate, independent self to protect and foster. We don't question it or try to explain it. We just walk around throughout our days, protecting it, self-aggrandizing, feeling bad when it's diminished in any way, going through all kinds of emotional changes. And in fact, it is neither lasting nor is it one thing. I mean, look at this self. Is there any part of this, maybe some cells in my brain, that were there in that photograph 75 years ago? And then even the cells in my brain won't be here after I die. They'll deteriorate and disappear. So nothing endures. Nothing is single. What we consider to be a self is made up of an almost infinite number of parts, depending on how you divide it down. I mean, and yet, if we were to lose some of those parts, do we still think of ourselves as being diminished? If you were to lose your hand, if you were to lose a limb, if you are to be diminished physically or mentally in some way, do you regard yourself as fundamentally diminished? No, I'm still here. This I may be changed, I may be in pain, I may be suffering, and yet the I goes on. So all our suffering is associated with the preoccupation that we have this lasting, separate, and independent self to protect and foster. We don't try to question or explain it. Fundamentally, we are so emotionally involved with and attached to this self that we take it for granted. And yet what this chapter is going to be asking us to do is to constantly question that and to see that at any given moment, this self does not actually exist, that it was a myth that we created, and that it's unnecessary. So the meditator doesn't speculate about this self. He doesn't have to have theories about whether it does or doesn't exist. Instead, he or she trains themselves to watch dispassionately how their mind clings to this idea of self and mine, and how all suffering arises from this attachment. At the same time, he or she looks carefully for that self, tries to isolate it from all other experiences. Since it is the culprit as far as all one's suffering is concerned, one wants to find and identify it. The irony is that however much one tries, one does not find anything that corresponds to a lasting, independent, and single self. Instead, what one's find is a constantly changing multiplicity of dependent elements, that we are constantly dependent, we're constantly in relationship with the world around us in one way or another, even if it's just tying our shoes, much less talking to a friend or a group of friends, and that we are so many different things that are constantly in flux. All the cells in our bodies are changing, except our brain cells, and they'll change when we die. They'll die as well. So person or ego or personality isn't the problem, Kipple Sultan says. Any rational analysis shows that the person, personality, or ego is changing, a composite train of events conditioned by many complex factors. The question is, why then do we behave emotionally, as if it were lasting, single, and independent? We want it to be these three things. We want it to be lasting. We want it to be one thing. And we want it to be independent of everything else around it. Because if we're dependent on everything, we're weak. We're more subject to suffering, we think. It is this emotional response that Buddhism is questioning and examining. Feeling hurt or offended or proud or praised, one should ask oneself who or what exactly is feeling this way. So he says, think carefully about pain and suffering and ask yourself who or what it is that is suffering. Who is afraid of what will happen? Who feels bad about what has happened? Why does death seem such a threat when the present disappears every moment, scarcely having had a chance to arise? We're constantly experiencing death as these words come out and disappear, as this moment, this class takes form and then will disappear. And yet we anticipate our own deaths with great fear. So when we look for this self, we can't find it. It gradually begins to dawn that it isn't there and never was. This is a realization that each one of us can come to now in varying degrees, each according to our capacity. That in fact, we can live our lives in the light of understanding that the self was a myth, a lie even, and that we can live our lives much more effectively in its absence, the absence of that myth. It takes a long time to break through the belief in this, but when that happens, there is an immediate release of tension, he says, and suffering. The cause of that suffering has gone. The cause of it was mental attachment to something that was not there. That is something we should engrave on our eyeballs, write on the refrigerator, do something. That the cause of all our suffering is attachment to something that wasn't there. The self. This idea of me and my benefit, me and my hurt, me and my future and past, none of which exists. So how do we investigate? We instinctively identify ourselves with our minds and bodies. We say, I have a headache. Do we mean the I is one thing and the head with its ache another? Or do we mean the head with its ache is the I? I have a headache. It's very confused. For example, if one has a limb or organ removed or transplanted, would we still be I? I mean, a lot of us have had various parts of our bodies removed or transplanted or changed. Are we still I, the same person? It feels that way, doesn't it? I. And yet, how many parts of our bodies have we lost already? Especially those of us who are older and in our 70s. What if we replaced most of ourselves? And I put a note in here. I've had all my major joints replaced and much more. And yet I seems unchanged, ever present. How much can I use? How much make? It says, how much can I use other things, not myself, another person's heart or brain, and still be I? What if I had a transplant? I mean, I've got a pacemaker. Am I still I? It feels like the I is unchanged to me. And yet, that's a pretty radical change. Something else is running my heart. Or would we at some point become multiple? We're very unclear about where this ends and where I ends and the other begins. My body, my possessions, my friends, my loved ones. We take the I as so important. Buddhism discovers is that suffering is always connected with a strong emotional attachment to the sense of self. So where and how is the I experienced? Buddhism asks this question. We feel a sense of continuity in ourself. We feel it is ours, distinct from others, that it endures at core unchanged over time, distinct and separate from any other, that I have an independent existence. I can leave the current situation and I am still me. And yet all of this is just a mental activity, a thought. What do we mean by mind? We say, my mind. We're very vague and imprecise about this, often conflating I with mind. I am sad. I am smart. So we say, this I is smart. We conflate the two. We bring them together as though they're one, the I and the mind that we evaluate as being smart. And yet we say things like, I cannot control my mind, as though they were separate, like when we try to meditate and we can't stay with meditation. We drift off into dreams. I can't control my mind, as though the two were separate. And yet we regard them as being one. Sometimes it says this seems to be the same lack of clarity that enables us sometimes to talk as if the self were the mind, and sometimes as if the self owned the mind. I think, therefore I am, René Descartes. Yes, but we do. You say, I think, he said, he was an 18th century French philosopher, said, I think, therefore I am. From a Buddhist perspective, that's pretty good. Since I think I am, therefore I am. And yet we say things like, I cannot control my mind. He says, but I am is just a thought that comes and goes. How can it be the I? I am comes and goes. The Shravaka approach is to investigate experience by simply being aware as possible every moment, meaning coming back to this. And when we do come back to this, the whole notion of I, of self, begins to dissolve because it's unnecessary. In fact, it's worse than unnecessary. It clutters. He points out, in order to carry out this investigation as systematically as possible, Buddhism organizes experience into a number of comprehensive sets of categories. The ayatanas, the dhatus, these are having to do with the mind looking through an organ, like the sense organ, like the eye or the ear, and seeing an object, like a visual object or a sound. These are the ayatanas and the dhatus. The nidanas, which explain how we get caught up in a chain. I gets caught up in a chain of compulsive, seemingly inevitable necessary actions and reactions that enslave us. And then there's the skandhas that explain the notion of a personality, a sense of self. He says, all our experience arises moment by moment as isolated impersonal events. After these have arisen, so soon after that it seems simultaneous, we become emotionally involved and create a whole scenario of self versus the world or other. So this is our dilemma, that we're constantly in this battle between this imagined self, which only exists in thought, and the world or other, which seems to threaten it. So he talks about the five skandhas. The body is the first skandha. He says, is my hand me? We can break it down into tinier and tinier parts. Is my finger me? Is my knuckle me? Infinitely. And then the second skandha is the feelings between I and other. There are three of them, they call the three poisons. That aversion, you want the other away from you. Attraction, you want it towards you, and indifference. They're not the self because none of them are lasting. They're continually changing, as is our awareness of our own body. It's constantly changing. Now I'm aware of the feeling of my bottom as it presses against the seat. Now I'm aware of my tongue as it moves in my mouth as I speak. It's constantly in change. The third skandha is perception, the first moment of cognition, of input through the senses, plus mind. And this makes 6 different kinds of the third skandha. There's the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. The input through the senses and mind. Although one thinks it is oneself that is perceiving these things, the screen, the sound, whatever it may be, one does not think that these perceptions are the self. None of them has the characteristics of self, since none of them is lasting. And this is the third skandha, the third element of what it takes to be I. The fourth is mental constructions, which includes all of the other mental activities not covered in the first 3 skandhas. Thinking patterns of thought, negative emotions such as desire, pride, and jealousy, and healthy emotions such as love, devotion, and patience. This fourth skandha, samskara, also means predisposition in the sense of tracks left by former deeds that condition one's present thinking and behavior. So you develop habits of behavior and habits of thinking. When you see a particular thing, you react habitually in a certain way. This is the fourth skandha, samskara. None of these exhibit a separate, independent, lasting element that one could call a self. All of these mental events arise and pass away in the instant, and they're gone. Finally, the fifth, consciousness, a moment of awareness, an awareness or knowing behind the other 4 skandhas. We might even call it the mind itself, as opposed to mental events that occur within it. We might feel that this is really what we mean by the I or self. The Shravaka tries to be aware of the smallest conceivable moment of experience in order to be sure that one has missed nothing in one's search for a lasting, separate, permanent self. And what we find is that every moment of experience has 2 elements, the experience and the experiencer, the knower and the known. The smallest conceivable moments of consciousness are called consciousness, vijnana in Sanskrit. Jnana means to know. The prefix, means divided. Divided how? Between subject and object, knower and known. This is confused knowing. It's the 5th part skandha, so it's partial or divided knowing, versus pure jnana, which is the aspect of a Buddha, the knowing of a Buddha, which is undivided. It's just one. It's the knowingness that is one with space, that is always here, that has no connection with I. I comes and goes in it, but jnana, undivided consciousness, doesn't need an I. So he says, when we refer to the self, we're referring to the stream of vijnanas, of divided knowing, form, sound, smell, taste, touch, or mind, each different from the one before. So consciousness can only be momentary. So this cannot be self. So he says, so the mind that seems to be behind all our experience cannot be the self either, because it's constantly coming and going, divided. Finally, at the end of our analysis, we arrive at the conclusion that the self is simply a vague and convenient concept that we project now here and now there onto a stream of experiences and is nothing in and of itself. You can't find it. Buddhism isn't telling us to believe in or not believe in the self. It is saying that when one looks at the way one suffers and the way one thinks and responds emotionally to life, it is as if one believed there were a self that was lasting, single, and independent. And yet on closer analysis, no such self can be found. And in fact, the way a Buddha lives is without those three misconceptions, the three misconceptions of svabhava, of own being, that there is a lasting, independent, and singular element to anything. There is nothing that is lasting, nothing that is singular. Everything is part of something else and constantly interchanging and interacting with it. So interdependence. Because when so emotionally attached to the concept of self, all one's mental patterning and habits of thought, the samskaras, the fourth skandha, feed and strengthen this idea. The actions of this self create the world one is living and acting in. So even though the self has no absolute existence, in terms of the relative, one still has to suffer the results of one's past good and bad actions. In fact, the self is really like, he likens it to a candle flame, which has been burning all day, let's say. Flame was never the same flame from one moment to the next. There was no single independent lasting flame there at all. In fact, there was no single independent lasting candle. Every instant the candle was melting, changing. Nevertheless, it is still meaningful to talk about the flame and the candle from a relative point of view. And then he says, just as in a dream of being chased by a tiger, when the dream ends, the suffering just fades away. In the same way, when one focuses one's attention inwardly on the absence of the self in the skandhas, that there is no self, all the suffering caused by taking the skandhas to be the self fades away. Then the mind can rest peacefully in empty space with perfect confidence and assurance and perspicacity, awareness, clarity. So finally, the fruit of the Shravaka practice, our instinctive emotional attachment or clinging to a vague notion of self is the source of all our suffering. That is another thing to put on your refrigerator or to engrave somewhere. Our instinctive emotional attachment or clinging to the vague notion of self, which is a myth, is the source of all our suffering. We think that what the Buddhist teachings are telling us is that we're actually in the minority. Those of us who believe in a self, there are infinite numbers, in fact, not even numbers, of enlightened beings who have conquered the belief in self. And so there are no numbers of them because they don't exist individually. We think we do, they don't. It's just we're in the vast minority. We're the suffering ones. We're the ones that the Buddhas come to help out of this dilemma that we are finding ourselves in, all of which revolves around the belief in a self, I, and all of which is untrue. And the way in which you experience the untruth of it is by coming present. Every time we come present, we let go of the thoughts of I and other, and we just are here with whatever is presenting itself. Whatever is presenting itself. And this is the practice. By doing this over and over again, and also by contemplating. That is, as Michael pointed out, by thinking about, does this self actually exist? Can I actually find it? Is it here? Is it not? Can I experience its absence? He says it is from the interaction of self and other that desire, hatred, and delusion arise. There are many variations on each of these. These unhealthy states produce actions with their results, all kinds of suffering. So the only way to remove one's suffering is to realize not self. And this is what the Shravaka, the first, we have the 9 yanas, right? Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana. In the Vajrayana, there's 6. The Mahayana is 1. In the Hinayana, there are 2. The 2 yanas of the Hinayana, the first one, and this is what we're talking about now, is the Shravaka yana, the yana of the hearers. The second one in the Hinayana is the Pratyeka Buddha yana, the self-enlightened Buddhas. The Shravaka's main virtue is the discovery of not self. And this is only intensified in the yanas as the practitioner moves on. Thus the goal of the Shravaka for the Shravaka is the removal of suffering called nirvana. The Shravaka is not trying to remove the suffering of all beings. That comes with the Mahayana. Nor is he or she trying to attain Buddhahood. The Shravaka does not have the vision, the understanding, nor the confidence necessary to do that. The Shravaka is just trying to remove his or her own suffering. And that is a very powerful thing to do. And then one becomes much cleaner, much less of a nuisance to the world. He says, nonetheless, one cannot say that his realization of emptiness is not very profound. It is said that it corresponds to that of the bodhisattvas on the 1st to 6th levels, 6 bhumis. It removes the veils of ignorance and confusion that make deeper and more subtle levels of emptiness so hard to reach. Therefore, by realizing the not self emptiness of the skandhas, one is preparing the way for the higher vehicles, whose goal is not just removing one's own suffering, but the suffering of all beings. Because there's nothing else to do at those levels. One is utterly inspired to do it. And then I love this last part of the chapter. Meditation procedure. I hope you all have read this. It is best to take each stage one at a time and practice it until some definite experience has arisen. It is important to have a regular meditation schedule, 15 to 30 minutes in the morning and evening. This is Sultan Gyatso. One can build up from there, meditating for longer and longer periods. And also by bringing it into one's daily life, meditation and action. At the same time, don't let your mind get tight with effort and ambition. Not too tight and not too loose. The old metaphor of tuning a stringed instrument. And then he says, have good meditation posture and always begin by taking refuge and rousing bodhicitta motivation. Thank you, Khenpo Sultan Gyatso. In the beginning, reflect on the meaning of not self, beginning of your meditation. This is something really good to reflect on. Study it. Read this chapter over. To reflect on this idea of not self, that it doesn't actually exist, that we're living a myth. I mean, if you want to be a Buddhist, this is the foundation, the beginning, that the self is a myth, a lie, worse than a myth, a lie, a pernicious untruth. And we can reflect on this in the beginning of our meditation practice at any time. But once you've developed some confidence and understanding, don't bother to keep investigating, just go straight into emptiness meditation. That means awareness, giving up thoughts of I and other. He says, at the meditation stage of your practice, one should just rest in meditation without hesitation. And then finally, at the end of each session, you dedicate the merit to the enlightenment of all beings. And he says, between sessions, this is the important part, between sessions meditation, reflect again and again on how there is no self in the skandhas. There is no self. And think of everything as being like a dream, a film, or magical illusion. There is the appearance of a self, but there's no self there really. It's just a dream, a movie, a TV show. Thinking like this, how can unhealthy emotions such as greed, hate, and delusion arise? If these do not arise, how can suffering arise? So we're being enjoined, we're being asked to realize this very profound, radical Buddhist teaching, the teaching that we're constantly thinking about I this, I that, and that it's a myth, a lie, a delusion, doesn't exist. That we could live our lives much more effectively without it. We could awaken from this dream, this illusion. So I'm going to stop there. And Michael, maybe we just should have a discussion. What do you think? There's a lot of material.
Yeah, we could have questions and answers, and maybe if there's time, we could do that contemplation.
Great. Now you want to lead the contemplation at some point?
Yeah, but let's see if there, people have questions or comments first. Yeah.
Yeah. By the way, I'll just tell you this too about Khenpo Sultan Gyatso. Quite a number of Buddhist teachers, Tibetan, showed up here in Boulder when Trungpa Rinpoche was in residence here. And he never let them teach, except Khenpo Sultan Gyatso. He liked Khenpo Sultan Gyatso. But other teachers came, some of whom are very much revered today, and I'm not going to name names, but some of whom are still around or almost still around. And he didn't let them teach. He felt that Americans were too gullible, that they were sort of overcome by the robes and the Tibetanisms and the exoticisms and foreignisms, and he didn't like it. And so he didn't let these people teach. Sometimes he let them appear in public with him, sort of an honored position, but not teach. And then Khenpo, he did. He endorsed Khenpo. So just for your information. Ed.
Without self, there is no suffering. How can we look at a Ukrainian soldier who's had his legs blown off and severely burned, and he's living life subsequent to that, and think that myself or my concept of me is in any way tied to the suffering that that human being is feeling, and consequently that I, as a compassionate human, feel for that person?
There are two aspects to suffering. One, you can't avoid death, loss of life, loss of limbs, whatever it might be. And the other is complaint about it. One is optional, the other is not. And what this is all about is the optional one, complaint. We can't avoid the inevitable suffering. We're all going to die. We're all going to get sick if we haven't already. And there are plenty of people in this room who already have. But the question is, how do you deal with it? How do you deal with your own death? And Buddhism is saying, you just live it and die it with awareness, with open-heartedness, with compassion, with lack of complaint, and then you become a Buddha. Buddhism also teaches that there's no end to consciousness. There is an end to consciousness of I, but no end to consciousness. And so enlightened people, many of them, not many, but some, live on. Padmasambhava lives on. He achieved what's called the rainbow body. So does Vimalamitra. Padmasambhava lives on an island off the coast of Jambudvipa called Padmakara. Vimalamitra lives on a mountain that you can visit in China called Wutaishan, 5-peak mountain. Consciousness continues. The I does not. The I is constantly changing, disappearing. So these two aspects of suffering, I think, one of them is much worse. Does that help? Anybody want to argue with that? What do you think, Michael?
There's a sutra by the Buddha where he talks about a person being hit with an arrow, and that the person who is the person who's not a practitioner, what he refers to it, as frequently did in the sutras, as childish being, that they experience a multitude of pains because there's all the anxiety about it happening again. There's all the, why did this happen? Why me? All of the complaining. Whereas a person who is a practitioner just deals with the situation as it is. And he says for a person who practices, it's like they just get hit with one arrow. For a person who doesn't, it's like they get hit with many arrows. So it's just another way of saying, I think, what John said.
Robert.
Sure. Right. Another way of saying that is that, what is it? Pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. Right?
Yes.
Pain is the arrow, the pain and the suffering is the additional. So thank you both. I found this very interesting. And one of the things I've found that I've always struggled to grasp is this concept of no self, because it runs against the very grain that we're taught, either in other faiths and other experiences, that, I have a checking account. You have another checking account. Therefore, we're two different selves with two different checking accounts. And so it's difficult to let that go, and trying to imagine that there really is no self is like, for me, trying to divide by zero, and I'm trying to get past that cognitive limitation. And so one of the ones, he gives it, there's 5 different skandhas, and the 5th one, consciousness, seems like the one that, if there was any of the 5 that was going to create some sort of a self-argument, that would be it. But he responds in the text, as you mentioned, that since consciousness can only ever be momentary, and such a momentary phenomenon would never qualify for the title of self. But I'm not able to understand how the fact of the moment-to-moment existence of consciousness, of what a consciousness sees, disqualifies that consciousness of being a self or not self. Yeah, we may see things in moment-to-moment, but how does that make our consciousness that we have not an I, not a separate, not a self? Because the consciousness is what's the perceiver, but the moment-to-moment is the perceived. Maybe I'm not being clear. Maybe I'm being too obtuse for my own good. I'm just trying to grasp, because how I would have thought of it as intuitively is, well, who am I? I'm my consciousness, and my consciousness ends, so do I. But that's not what this text says, and what, of course, Buddhist says. And I sure love some guidance on trying to understand that.
One thing might help if you took a look. There's a chapter in Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism on the skandhas, and it's somewhat different than this. It's more subtle. And what's it called? I forget the name of that chapter. Hold on. But I recommend reading it. It's
In another book or this book?
in Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism. It's called The Development of Ego. You're cutting through spiritual materialism. And in it, what he says is that ego develops out of an error. And in fact, standard Buddhism talks about this error. It's called trulpa in in Tibetan. And the error is this, that It's as though there were open space right now. And then suddenly within open space, something emerges as being sort of concretized, as being a figure against which the rest of the open space becomes ground. It's magical. This is the error. This is the fundamental error, the birth of ego. Because when that thing emerges, a figure against the ground, it implies a perceiver of that figure. And suddenly you've got not only this figure, but you have a perceiver. There's the other, and then there's this journey, the implication, active implication to I. And then, so now we've got this relationship, and I is utterly dependent on the existence of this other out there. Now, the other is just a momentary flashing. So what the I wants to do is to reach out and solidify this whole thing. And in reaching out, that's the second skandha. It reaches out and it wants to feel the quality. It wants to make a relationship with that other. And in reaching out, there are three possible relationships. You can want to push the other away because you regard it as dangerous. You can draw it to you because you regard it as helpful to your existence, to the existence of the I. Or you can remain neutral if it's indifferent. These are called the three poisons. They are the three feelings that inhabit the second skandha. Push, pull, remain the same. All of this is dependent on this momentary flashing of this other out there that suddenly creates a figure ground effect and implies the existence of a perceiver of the other. And the skandhas develop on from there, because once you've got this feeling in the second skandha, then you want to act on it. If it's dangerous, you want to push it away. If it's something that's going to enhance your being, you want to pull it to you. And if it's neither of those, you just stay indifferent. This is the third skandha, impulse, he calls it. And then you begin to get the fourth skandha, which is a descriptive skandha. It's conceptual. It's describing all of these relationships, these three fundamental relationships, in all their permutations and combinations. So you take a little bit of aversion and you add a little bit of desire, and maybe you get some jealousy, and you begin to get all the different mental events that are characterized by ego, that are characterizing this I-other relationship. And there are they differ in number, depending on the system, the school of Hinayana Buddhism that you're engaged with. And this is the fourth skandha. It's called samskara, which literally means collection of all these mental events that are elaborating this relationship between I and other, which is momentary. It just goes back and forth and back and forth. It has to be kept going. When we meditate, we cut that back and forth for an instant or more, and we just rest in awareness. And then the fifth skandha, we don't really need to go, but that's vijnana. And what that is that everything begins to get confused. The energy of the third, the push-pull, indifference, the concept, the labels of the fourth, all the names that come up in all the different thoughts that we have, they all begin to get confused, and we begin to get the fully blown ego with its 6 realms and a lot more. So all of this is based on a fundamental error, the error of suddenly something appearing against the ground of space. And we say, that exists. What's my relationship to it? And we're off. And this is created over and over and over again, instantaneously and over time. This is the notion that you can read about in that chapter in Cutting Through, which I recommend.
Thank you. That's all I have to think about.
Yeah, I mean, all of this depends on an understanding and a communication of what reality really is, and that means what our nature, who we are, really is. And what it is open space full of flashing lights and colors, the phenomenal world, this beautiful, constantly changing, vivid world that lacks the three qualities of svabhava. It doesn't exist nothing exists over time. Everything is constantly changing. Nothing is one. Everything is made up of parts and is part of everything else, and nothing is independent. Everything is constantly arising in dependence on everything else, just like these words are arising in dependence on the silence and on your ears and everything. My voice, this larynx.
If you look at it in just the way the Kempo Sultram Gyamtso says, look at a moment of consciousness. Is it lasting or permanent? No, it's changing all the time. We're angry one moment, we're happy another, we're looking at something, we're looking at something else. It's not permanent, it's not lasting. Is it singular? No, there's all kinds of pieces to it. All the sense perceptions, all our thoughts, all our feelings. Is it independent? No. As John was saying, it's always I in relation to something else. The self, it's dependent on a lot of causes all at once. So that what fools us is the apparent continuity of it, but even that is just a thought. That's where, I really found, I talked about it when we talked about chapter 9 in Shantideva a couple of weeks ago, where Zigar Contral says, if we say I crossed the river and then a year later say I crossed the river, we think it's the same thing, but actually it's a completely different river. We can give it the same name, we can conceptually see it that way, but in reality, it's a completely different river. Rivers even change where they flow, let alone the fact that it's obviously the water that was there when we crossed it at one point is not the water that's there at another time. And in the same way, we get fooled by an apparent continuity that's actually continuously discontinuous.
Like the candle.
What was that?
Like the candle and its flame.
Yeah, same thing. Yeah, same thing.
Same thing.
It's not the same flame from moment to moment.
So
on a relative truth level it is, and for all intents and purposes, we can use it that way. But when we actually stop and think about it, when we actually look at the experience in the moment, we realize it's not the same flame, it's not the same river, it's not the same self.
And we're being invited into a new and very different and magical world, each one of us. That these teachings are this invitation. Transformative. Radical. It's not subtle or trivial. Mark.
I was just thinking, does the concept of relative and absolute reality help us understand this somewhat? I mean, in this world, I have a mortgage, or I have the family, or I have my body and my life, and then in ultimate reality, well, or at my death, I don't have any of those things. I don't know. I was just spitballing.
I hate to tell you, but in absolute reality, you're still going to have a mortgage and illness and all the rest.
It might look different to you, though.
Huh?
You might feel differently about it. It might look different to you, but yeah, the mortgage. Absolute truth doesn't negate relative truth.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the Buddha still, after he achieved enlightenment, had to live about another 50 years? What was it? For about another 40 years or 30 years before he died, and then he had to go through death, because that was his karma. He was on that train, and we're all on a train. Even if we wake up and get enlightened, we have our past karma playing itself out in the form of our bodies, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
But we can have a very different, like Robert said, it's a difference between pain and suffering. How did you put it, Robert? It's a famous quote.
Pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional or unavoidable. Pain is unavoidable, suffering is optional.
Right. That's it. Just think, if all of these people in this Zoom room got enlightened, what a powerful force that would be in the world. Even if we just begin to understand egolessness. Wow, that's profound. We get hints of it, and to develop that. Anybody else? We still have some time before we end. Robert? No?
I said I could keep going, but I don't want to hog the show. But so I think that was very helpful, and I think especially also what you said, Michael, about is the consciousness, is it continuous? No, we're angry one moment, happy the latter. And so if you explore the consciousness, it's sort of a state of mind or how we're behaving, we're flickering from thought to thought. We don't like, we like this, we process this, we evaluate, and that I can see how then the consciousness really does become just these infinitesimal slices of experience that have no lasting value because our mind is flitting from thought to thought as it is trained to do. And the only moment we cut that thread is we sit in meditation, and for 5-10 seconds or so, or until you remind us in meditation that we're jumping from thought to thought, we should return to it. That's when we're actually achieving something that's lasting. And so really maybe the ultimate goal is to achieve that lasting awareness all the time by understanding that everything else is discontinuous, is a part of is only a part of something smaller that's broken down and interdependent anyway. And it reminds me of if it's someone, it's not Tibetan, but it's out of school, but Vietnamese monk Thich Nhat Hanh talks about interbeing and that how we're all closely interconnected. And I think that concept of interbeing, which he uses in a number of his books, I think has some relevance to the discussion here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the alternative to seeing the self as independent, is recognizing interbeing, not just in everything. There's a beautiful piece about seeing the cloud in the paper, if you've ever read that, where he talks about if you're in the mind of a poet, you'll see the cloud in the paper, that it was the cloud that provided the rain, that allowed the tree to grow, to become the paper. And it just goes on and on with all of the different things to what seems like a simple object in front of us. In fact, there's all kinds of causes and conditions that are existent within it. So that's just, so it doesn't have its own inherent existence. It comes into being as a result of causes and conditions. If the causes and conditions change, that appearance ceases to exist, because it doesn't have its own inherent self. And
when we chase it, we suffer.
Yeah,
that's it, right? Mm-hmm. We chase the change as permanent when it isn't. That's when the hook gets in our craw, and we're gonna suffer, which we do all the time.
One part of this text that really resonated for me reading it this time was the part looking for the self. It's very important to remember it's an emotional response that one is examining. And I've really been thinking the last week, when I start feeling rushed, when I feel attacked, when I do something where I embarrass myself, if I remember to think about that, who or what is that self? Where is that self? And it kind of begins to dissolve a little bit.
I really recommend, if you haven't read this chapter, read it and contemplate. Contemplate it. Would you say, Michael?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And again, moment to moment, if the thought comes up, to look at present experience in terms of what we're talking about here.
We're getting very close to the end, in case anybody has something to say that they haven't yet. Cutting through spiritual materialism, Robert? That's what you're...
Yeah, I was Googling it. So the book is titled Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, and the chapter is The Development of Ego, page 143. So I'm already on it.
Yeah. Good.
And you could look at where is the self that's on it.
Right.
What is the self that's on it?
And what am I on? And what is it?
Still, it's worth reading on a relative level.
I heard this one the other day. I guess it comes from Alan Watts that people talk about, and it's like a metaphor for, I think, for what we're talking about. When people say it's cold outside or it's snowing outside, and it's like, well, what is the it that's snowing? I mean, there's snow happening. What is this it that is snowing? And I think that's just maybe another way of what we're talking about here. What is the I that's aware? What is the, I that's angry or something?
Well, I think we ought to end. Darlin, what do you want to say? So glad for Robert's question, because I've been having the same struggle to understand in the same way. So now I'm on it too. Thank you. Thank you, Darlin.
I would like to just offer one little thing here, and that is I think that this is a kind of an intellectual approach and through contemplation. And for me, at least, it was through meditation where real understanding came, you know? I mean, I remember years ago, I went to a talk, I forget the guy's name, who beautifully explained emptiness. So I really understood it. Wow. And then a day later, it had no meaning, And it was only through a lot of meditation that I started to really get it, because it is an experience. It's that kind of understanding.
Shall we say the closing chants? Michael, you're muted. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll put them up. Hold on. I'll mute everyone again. So we'll close by reciting a prayer for peace and dedicating the merit generated through our meditation, contemplation, and hearing for the benefit of all sentient beings. By the blessings of enlightened and compassionate ones, by the power of my positive actions of 3 times and my prayers of pure aspiration, may wars, conflicts, epidemics, and all other maladies dissolve in this world, and may the earth and all who live on this earth enjoy the abundance of well-being. May all learn to live lovingly with each other. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great east, may the lotus garden of the Rigdon's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory.
Thank you, John and Michael and everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Great talk. Thank you. Well done.
That was wonderful.
Yes. Ivy
Very
liked the
nice.
class. She said it was very interesting.
Yeah.
I'd give an A to my instructors. Yep. Good job. Even my dog liked it. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
That's Chewy over there. Where is he? He's over there. No. It's okay. See, I called his name and now he's running for the door.